And of course, we live in a culture also that likes to hide the shadow and not pay attention. But let's talk about shadow for a second. Shadow, concept originally introduced in psychological terms by Carl Jung, is that aspect of our life, or we're going to talk about it more collectively, that's hidden away, that we're not aware of, that operates in ways that we ignore or don't pay attention to or deny. You can know parts of your shadow erupting at different times when you have an experience, and then you go home or wherever and you go back and you say, oh, I can't believe I did that again. That there's some part of you that's acting that's not even under your kind of conscious control, and something else happens. And so shadow, when we don't pay attention to the things that are shadowy in our life, when we don't make them conscious, then they rule us. When we begin to turn our attention to them, then it becomes possible for those energies both to become more workable, and they actually liberate us from just acting out of increasing habit. What's really important to understand in terms of human development, and this is quite a mirror to what Ken Wilber likes to talk about in his map of human development, is that I'll use the map, the Buddhist map of the foundations of mindfulness, that it's important for us as we grow and develop as human beings to pay attention or become mindful and aware of our body and our senses, which includes connection with the physical world, of feelings and emotions, of thoughts, and then of our relationships to things. And it turns out in this mandala, or this description of wholeness, that we can be well developed in one area and not in another. This is kind of the description of shadow. So, for example, you can have an Olympic level athlete who's an emotional idiot. You can have a Nobel Prize winning professor of whatever it happens to be who can't find their shoes or their body. You understand what I'm saying? And when we don't realize the importance of paying attention to the different dimensions of our humanity, first, we lose touch with them, but secondly, we also have these kind of idealizations that happen that are really kind of crazy. And I've seen it when I think about shadow as a spiritual professional, if you will, in my industry. I know a lot of swamis and lamas and mamas and, whatever. And it turns out that a certain number of swamis and lamas and mamas, shockingly enough, have misbehaved. We have all read about this, and then you go, how could it be that Zen master, that lama, that whatever, how could they do that? They're supposed to be so enlightened. Well, it turns out that they might be enlightened in certain ways, and in other ways, they're idiots. Or more honorably to say, they're really unconscious, and their shadow gets the best of them. And so you start to see the shadow manifest in different ways. In the spiritual world, from on the side of the teachers, I've heard teachers say, well, I'm a master, I'm a lama, I'm a Zen master, so there's no need for me to follow the rules. That's a recipe for you-know-what. Or, I give so much anyway, why shouldn't I also, pluck a little bit of pleasure out of the work that I do or think. All the kind of rationalizations. But it's not just those spiritual teachers. It can be us as well. We can do a whole spiritual bypass where we think, oh, this is spiritual, and that part doesn't count. Money doesn't count. Sex doesn't count. Or those aren't spiritual. Sexuality is, in its essence, profoundly spiritual and beautiful and connects us with this great mystery of being alive. How could it not be? And money is really an exchange of energy, and if you don't take it in a spiritual way and include it, then it starts to rule you. So there's all those kind of spiritual shadows, both for the teachers, but also for the students in their idealization or your ideas about yourself. There are cultural shadows. And probably the best passage that I could read of just a few lines to explain this is from James Baldwin, where he writes, where are you, James? I thought you were here. I imagine one of the reasons that people cling to their hate and prejudice so stubbornly is that they sense that once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with their own pain. And what this means is that if we can't tolerate our insecurity, is there anybody who's not insecure? Please raise your hand. Where things aren't changing and you don't know how it's going to be. It's like Somerset Maugham said, there are 3 rules for writing the great English novel. Unfortunately, no one knows what they are, right? This is our predicament in human incarnation. It's uncertain. So what Baldwin is saying here is if we can't acknowledge and tolerate our uncertainty or our fears, then we project those, that's our shadow, we project them onto the communists, the gays, the immigrants, the Muslims. We have the enemy du jour, the Russians, whoever it happens to be, as a society and as a culture, because we can't look honestly at ourselves and tolerate. So to become aware of shadow is not just a personal thing, but it's also collectively a really profound invitation or question and a necessity for us. And this from Anne Wilson Schaaf, who wrote Society as an Addict. The best adjusted person in our society is the person who's not dead and not alive, just numb, a zombie. When you're dead, you're not able to do any work for the society, but if you're fully alive, you must constantly say no to many of the processes of society, the racism, the polluted environment, the nuclear threat, the arms race, drinking unsafe water, eating carcinogenic foods. Thus, it's in the interest of modern consumer society to promote those things that take the edge off, keep us busy with our fixes, and keep us slightly numbed out and zombie-like. In this way, our modern consumer society itself functions as an addict. You understand that there's a way in which we are being put to sleep in our education and in our commercialism, and that is, again, the shadow of the society. So I'm just naming these things. Cultural shadow, spiritual shadow, business shadow. I remember being teaching, as I have, at a number of different very successful and wonderful high-tech firms. And this firm wanted to imbue mindfulness and compassion throughout the organization, this big company. That's all great. But at the same time, they were growing wildly, they were hiring all the time, and the actual culture is full of ambition, aggression, competition. Okay, let's be mindful and compassionate, but how many hours are you working? What's the payout? How many, whatever it's clients or widgets or how much code or whatever, it was all being measured. And the shadow of it was, we don't want to talk about that. What we want to talk about is mindfulness and compassion. Ha 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 ha. So this is the stuff that we don't want to talk about, and the same in relationship, things that you can't look at in your relationship, whether it's the expectations that aren't spoken, the unconscious things, or the things that people kind of try to maneuver around addiction. Now, at least in our culture, we can talk about addiction in ways we couldn't decades ago. Now we can talk about domestic violence, but when it's there, often it's not talked about, and the aggression and all of those things underneath it. So what is going on in our relationships that we don't talk about and that we can't look at and that's hidden? Relationship, business, culture, individual. The other thing to say is that and we're going to take most of our time for questions, so I'll just finish up a couple more things, is that there's also a positive shadow. That is to say, this is from Robert Johnson, a Jungian analyst. He writes, that it's difficult for many of us to believe in our own goodness, and the shadow means the things that we don't acknowledge about ourselves. Curiously, people resist the noble aspects of their shadow more strenuously than they hide their dark sides. It's more disruptive to find out you have a profound nobility of character than to find out you're a bum. And so another dimension of the shadow fits together with how much self-judgment we have and that we've learned as human beings in our culture, in our education, in our families. And over these years, Trudy and I have worked together for, practiced together and then worked together for many, many decades. And early on, it became clear that in the spiritual life of the West, there is so much self-hatred and self-judgment. We had this conversation with the Dalai Lama. What do you do about self-hatred? He didn't understand it. Self-hatred? And he went back with his translator, self-hatred, what could this? There's no word for it in Tibetan. And back and forth conversing, what does this mean? Finally, he got it. He looked at us as teachers, and he said, this is a mistake. Well, thank you. But it turns out that for a wise spiritual life, or a wise human life, that's what's necessary for us is as much self-compassion and self-care, not in a kind of narcissistic way, but in an honorable way. For compassion to be complete, the circle of compassion has to include the well-being of others and the well-being of this one here. And you can ask this simple question, is this compassionate for them and for this one? And when we don't ask that, then again, there's a kind of shadow that's left out. And we don't carry our own integrity and our own self-regard. At Esalen, where I used to teach, they would say the bigger the front, the bigger the back. So the more kind of grandiose someone might seem to be, or you get puffed up to be, more likely the bigger the shadow. So the kind of questions that we want to look at are, what are the shadows in ourselves, in our workplace, in our relationships, and what does it mean to turn toward them and to face whether it's the unspoken things in the relationship or the suffering of the culture or the insecurity of life, and not in an idealistic way. One of the beautiful things about our best teachers, like the Dalai Lama, will say, sometimes I get angry and then I realize what's the use. And he's trying to be human in that. Or we were teaching together with Ram Dass, and he said, oh yeah, I flunked the course a lot of times and then I start over again. And you hear that common humanity and you realize that we're in it together, and the idea is not to perfect yourself, but it's really to perfect your compassion and your love. That's really what the game is about. Last passage I read from Carl Fried Durkheim, who was a Zen teacher in Europe. He says, the person who really being on the way falls upon hard times in the world will not, as a consequence, only turn to those friends who offer them refuge and comfort and encourage their old self to survive, but rather they will also seek out those who faithfully and inexorably help them to risk and challenge themselves so that they may endure the difficulty, make it conscious, and pass courageously through it. Only to the extent that a person exposes themselves over and over to annihilation of their ideals, certain things that they carry, can that which is indestructible be found in them. In this daring lies dignity and the spirit of awakening. So our willingness to look at shadow in these different ways, actually there's a kind of gold in it because it wakes us up. Even though there may be tremendous suffering and tremendous difficulty in going through it, it tells you, who are you really? What are your values? Where do you stand? And it gives an integrity to your life.